Hi, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, I'm going to go through all of the respiratory structures in my lab on our models that we have here. I'm going to start by looking at upper respiratory structures, and I guess maybe before that I could talk about the difference between upper respiratory and lower respiratory. Upper respiratory structures you can think of as being in the head and in the throat. It basically runs down to the larynx. So up here we have the nasal cavity, we have the paranasal sinuses, we've got the pharynx, oral cavity, and then we've got the larynx down here. Once we get below larynx to trachea, trachea is the beginning of the lower respiratory tract. Let me get a pointer here, and we'll start doing the upper respiratory structures. Again, this is nasal cavity. And to get into the nasal cavity, of course, the air passes through the nares, or the nostrils. This is the left side of the nasal cavity. And inside of the nasal cavity, we have concha. There are three conchae. This would be the left superior concha. This is the medial concha. And this is the inferior concha. And again, these are all left sides, so to do it properly, this would be the left superior concha, left medial concha, and left inferior concha. The paranasal sinuses, this is frontal sinus on this model. This is sphenoid sinus on this model. I've got another model that is better for sinuses. What it looks like is kind of a clear face. And in color here we have the different sinuses. If I do it from the front, and you could kind of feel on yourself for these, I guess kind of right behind your forehead and above your eyes, are the frontal sinuses. So this would be the left frontal sinus and the right frontal sinus in yellow here. And then behind your cheeks, we have the right maxillary sinus and the left maxillary sinus in pink on this model. To see the rest of them, it's best to look from the rear of the model. Here, basically between your eyeballs, are the ethmoid sinuses in green. So this would be the right ethmoid sinus, and this would be the left ethmoid sinus. And behind those we have the sphenoid sinus. And those are all the sinuses on this model. Oh, this one over here, this is inside of the temporal bone. So I guess you would call these temporal sinus. And it's part of your middle ear, not really part of the respiratory system. So that's it for that model. Let's go back to this one. We just finished sinus cavity and the sinuses, the paranasal sinuses, nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses. Going back here, this is the throat, also known as the pharynx. And when I point to it on a lab exam, I point to the very back of the throat and I ask for its different parts. And those parts depend on what the throat's behind. So here we get the nasal cavity. Behind the nasal cavity, we call this nasopharynx. Here's the oral cavity, and behind the oral cavity we have the oropharynx. And then down here we have the larynx, and behind the larynx is the laryngeal pharynx. And that's everything for upper respiratory, except for the larynx. Down here again, the entire organ down here would be the larynx. And then the parts that I have of the larynx here, this is the epiglottis. This whole thing here is epiglottis. That's the thing that flaps down and covers over the airway when we swallow. This is the thyroid cartilage. You can feel the thyroid cartilage on the front of your neck. We call it the Adam's apple. Below that we have this smaller cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage comes out and wraps around and would connect back here. It's thicker on the back end, so this is also cricoid cartilage. Between the cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage, we have the Cricothyroid Ligament. I'll show you that from the front in a second here. These here are the vocal folds or vocal cords. We actually have two sets of them. One are called false vocal cords, the other ones are true vocal cords. When I ask for it, I just want you to be able to say vocal cords or vocal folds. That's the other name for them. As promised, I'll show you those cartilages from the front. If I take this head, put it back together again, this is what you might see in a gross dissection of a human neck. This large cartilage in front, again, you can touch this part, it's your Adam's apple. This is the thyroid cartilage. And you can even feel this on yourself. If you slide your finger down, you'll reach a notch. And that notch is where the Cricothyroid Ligament is. And then below that, we have the Cricoid Cartilage. So again, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, Cricothyroid Ligament. Below that, of course, we have the trachea, and you can see the nice hyaline cartilage rings around the trachea here. Also, before I open it back up again, I wanted to show you the back of it. There's a tube behind your trachea. This is the tube for swallowing. It's called the esophagus, and the trachea, of course, is right in front of it. If we open the model back up, here's that trachea, the inside of the trachea, and here's the inside of that swallowing tube, the esophagus. I think those are, I'm trying to make sure these are all the structures. Oh, that's not everything. This is the oral cavity, and the oral cavity is considered part of the respiratory system as well because we can breathe through our mouths. Right above that, we have this bone here, these bones here. This part's part of the maxilla, and this is palatine bone, but they both make up the hard palate, so the bony palate, the part that you can touch with your tongue that's really hard on the roof of your mouth. And behind that, we have a very soft palate, and this is soft and mobile. It can, when we swallow, it moves back here and covers over the nasal cavity so that we don't swallow up into our nasal cavity. So that, again, is soft palate. You can also feel that with your tongue hanging off of the bottom of the soft palate. If you look in the mirror with your mouth wide open, you might be able to see the uvula. Enough here, I think we've covered all of the structures I can on this particular model, and we've done the sinuses. Let's move on to a torso model where we can start looking at some lower respiratory structures. Before I move on to that, let me get inside of this torso model, and we can see in here we have the right side of the nasal cavity. Here, way up here, we would have superior concha, right superior concha, and then this would be right medial concha, and this is right inferior concha. Another thing I should say is the two sides of the nasal cavity are separated, and this model shows you that thing that separates them. Here's the left side of the nasal cavity, and over here we cannot see the right side of the nasal cavity because they've included the nasal septum on this part of the model. That's kind of the wall between the right side of your nasal cavity and the left side of your nasal cavity. All right, back to this torso model. We're in the neck down here. This is the thyroid cartilage. We can't see the cricoid cartilage down here. It's covered with muscle. But this perhaps might be the cricothyroid ligament, maybe. Down below that, we have the trachea. And then I'll go down to the chest plate on here without removing it yet. You can see ribs down here, of course, and the muscle in between the ribs. They're called intercostal muscles. We can see the same inside. We can see ribs, and we can see intercostal muscles in here. If we're on the inside of the chest, by the way, these intercostal muscles are called internal intercostal muscles, and they are for breathing out. When they constrict, we breathe out. With that plate removed, here's that trachea again, and down here we have the lungs, the right lung and the left lung. Major differences between these two. The right lung has 3 lobes, so this is the superior lobe of the right lung, the medial lobe of the right lung, and then the inferior lobe of the right lung. If I pull this out, we can also see the back of it, and for my students at least, I can pull this lung out of the chest and you should still be able to recognize that it's a right lung. And the way to do that again is the 3 lobes. Superior lobe of right lung, medial lobe of right lung, and inferior lobe of right lung. If I flip it over, you can see the bronchi inside, some of the bronchial tubes in section, and then down here, the diaphragm muscle is attached to the bottom of this lung. So that's the other structure you should be able to recognize from this model, is this diaphragm at the bottom. Here we're looking at the left lung. Notice that the left lung does not have 3 lobes, it only has 2. Here's the superior lobe of the left lung, and here is the inferior lobe of the left lung. And again, you should be able to recognize it if I pull it out of the model. The last feature I'll talk about before I pull it out, sorry I forgot, this is the cardiac notch. And you can see why it's called the cardiac notch, because the heart takes up some space there where the cardiac notch is. If I pull this lung out, again, we should be able to recognize it by itself on the bench. And the features to make sure you can recognize it, only 2 lobes, superior lobe of left lung and inferior lobe of left lung. And then we have the cardiac notch over here. And again, if I flip it over, we can see some bronchi, and we can see diaphragm muscle at the bottom. You can also see blood vessels. I didn't point that out before, but there are blood vessels inside of here on this model. Those are the lungs. Inside of the chest, of course, we've got the other half of each of the lungs, and on this model, on this side, they've shown you some of the bronchi branching out in there and some of the blood vessels. I'll take out the heart, and we can see how the trachea comes down. Here's the trachea up here. It continues behind these big blood vessels, and it ends down here. So here's the end of the trachea. The trachea branches into the left primary bronchus and the right primary bronchus. From primary bronchus, we have branches that come off. We call those secondary bronchi. So this would be a secondary bronchi over here. This would also be a secondary bronchi here. And that's about as far as I can take it on this model. We'll go to the next torso model that we have in this lab. And again, well, let's see what kind of structures we can see up here in the head. We have a frontal sinus. This would be a left frontal sinus. And if we look inside, they've dissected, or they're trying to show dissecting open the other sinuses. This would be ethmoid sinus. These openings here would be ethmoid sinuses. And then back here, the big one back here would be sphenoid sinus. And again, we've got conchae. This would be right superior concha, right medial concha, and right inferior concha. We've got hard palate. We've got soft palate. We've got oral cavity, of course. We get down into the neck, and this has a larynx, so the entire organ down here is larynx, and half of the larynx is removable. So I'll go ahead and see if I can remove it without disturbing the chest plate too much. There we go. And let's look at this larynx a little bit. Set it up here where it'll stay. We've got thyroid cartilage here, and if you can see it, there's a little kind of oval of cricoid cartilage down here, and therefore in between we have cricothyroid ligament. It's easier to see in person, by the way. I don't think my video is showing you the color difference well enough. The other structure that's relatively easily seen in here are the vocal folds or vocal cords. If I turn this model sideways, again, here is thyroid cartilage. I'm touching it with my finger. And we don't see cricoid cartilage from this front side because the thyroid gland is covering it. And you can see a little piece of the trachea on this half of the larynx again. I will go to put this back, but first we'll look at the chest plate a little bit. Remember the muscle between the ribs called intercostal muscles? Notice the way they've arranged, or the way they're showing you these muscles here. Notice that you've got fibers of muscle going in this diagonal angle here, and then over the top of those, you've got muscles coming in the other direction. This is the one place on this model where we can see both internal intercostal muscles, important for breathing out again, and we can see external intercostal muscles, important for breathing in, by the way. So I wanted to make sure I showed you that. I'll take off this plate, set it aside, and now we can see the lungs. On this model, they don't delineate really well the place between the lobes of the lungs, but it's there and you can see it well enough. This would be the superior lobe of the left lung, the inferior lobe of the left lung, and you can see a bit of diaphragm down here at the bottom. And again, just like with the other model, I should be able to pull out these lungs, and my students should be able to recognize them even if they're sitting just on the bench. And again, this is left lung, and we can recognize that because it has 2 lobes, superior lobe of left lung and inferior lobe of left lung, and it has a cardiac notch. And again, if I flip this one over, just like on the other model, we have a bit of the diaphragm. And this model is also showing us some of the bronchi and the white are the bronchi, and then there's some red and blue blood vessels that are in these lungs. The right lung, here it is in the model, and again we have 3 lobes for the right lung. Here's the superior lobe of the right lung, the medial lobe of the right lung, and the inferior lobe of the right lung, and a bit of diaphragm at the bottom again. If I pull this out, put it on the bench, again you should be able to recognize that this is right lung because it has those 1, 2, 3 lobes, and it lacks a cardiac notch. And then on the back again we see a bit of the diaphragm on this right lung from this torso model. Going back to the torso model, let me put this larynx back in so that you can see it a little bit easier, get the full effect of the trachea. So here from the front on the neck we can see thyroid cartilage. If we go down here we can see trachea. If I remove the heart, now we can see the rest of the bronchial tree that we can see. Here's the bottom of the trachea. Here's the right primary bronchus, and this one would be a secondary bronchus. Here's the left primary bronchus. And I think that's about it on this model for respiratory structures. This is another model that I have just of the neck, and we can see larynx. By the way, this is the bone that's in the larynx up here. It's called the hyoid bone. So all of this would be larynx. This is thyroid cartilage. Below it is the cricoid cartilage. And again, between those 2 cartilages, we have a ligament called the Cricothyroid Ligament. And then the last thing I have in this model for respiratory is trachea down here. Let's go to this other model. This is the bronchial tree model. You could consider this model as showing only lower respiratory tract structures. So we've got trachea, we've got left primary bronchus and right primary bronchus, and we got a secondary bronchi out here, and a secondary bronchi out here, for example, and here. That would also be a secondary bronchus. And then all of the colored bronchi that you see on this model, the red and the light blue and the green and the dark blue, all of those colored pieces are tertiary bronchi. So again, to go through it all the way, trachea, left and right primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, secondary bronchus, secondary bronchus, and the colored ones are tertiary bronchi. So tertiary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, and so on. Flip this model over to the back side, and we can now see this muscle that runs the length of the trachea. It's called the trachealis muscle. The importance of that muscle, when we cough, let me see if I can get the color to work right. Whoops. When we cough, that muscle contracts, and it causes the trachea to do this and to get smaller. And imagine if you're trying to get something out of the respiratory tract, if you decreased the size of the respiratory tract when you're coughing, that's going to really move air through. So it makes our cough more efficient at expelling whatever is in the way. So that's this bronchial model and all the major structures that you need to know. All right, moving on to the last model that I have in my lab. It's not. We've got another torso model to play with in a minute, but we've got on this model gross structures on the right and microscopic structures on the left. So let's go through the gross structures that we can see here. Notice that I've got a sphenoid sinus, a frontal sinus. I've got a nasal cavity. I've got a nostril or nare here. I've got an oral cavity. I've got hard palate and soft palate. I've got right superior, medial, and inferior concha. I've got nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. I've got larynx, including the epiglottis, the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and the cricothyroid ligament between. And then here's the other part of the cricoid cartilage in back. And then for lower respiratory, I've got the trachea, the left primary bronchus, the right primary bronchus, and then I've got secondary bronchus, and even tertiary bronchus. And notice this shows you the lobes on the left lung, yes, and the cardiac notch. Not as dramatic on this model though. Ooh, and I've even got ribs and potentially intercostal muscles here. Over here we have the microscopic structure, and this would be microscopic bronchi. We call them bronchioles. Bronchioles are really, really tiny, and the other thing that sets bronchioles apart from bronchi have cartilage wrapped around them, hyaline cartilage. So you'll see hyaline cartilage histologically with a bronchi, but with a bronchiole, there's no hyaline cartilage around them. The stripes that you see here are smooth muscle. That's what they represent. So this is a terminal bronchiole, and the reason it's called a terminal bronchiole is it's the last part of the conduction zone. The conduction zone consists of everything that brings air down in and then out of the lungs, but does not exchange gases with the blood. The only things that exchange gases with the blood are these things down here. They're called alveoli. So the last bronchus that has alveoli attached to it, the last bronchiole that also has alveoli attached to it or budding off of it, is called a respiratory bronchiole, and it marks the beginning of the respiratory zone. And of course the major structure of the respiratory zone are these little bulges down here. They're called alveoli again. And the other thing this model shows is the alveolar capillaries. These blood vessels wrapped around the alveoli are called alveolar capillaries. And that's pretty much it for this model. Let's look at this. I've got a plastinated cat here, and we can see some of these respiratory structures on the cat. Here's a trachea. Up here would be the larynx, but they've left a lot of tissue on it, so you can't really see the cartilages and such. Down here in the chest cavity, of course, we have the left lung and the right lung. And of course, we have ribs, and we have intercostal muscle. So I guess that's possible as well. All right, this is the last model that I have. It's an older torso model, but it's nicely detailed, and what it lets me do is take the entire lungs out, so I like it. Let's start from the outside. Here's the larynx in this neighborhood here. This would be the thyroid cartilage, and this would be cricoid cartilage, but I rarely use that because it's not real good. We can open the head up for this one and look at a sagittal section again. Here we would have, of course, the nasal cavity. Inside the nasal cavity, this would be the right superior concha, the right medial concha, and the right inferior concha. You might be wondering why part of the inferior concha was cut away here. That's showing the opening where the nasal cavity connects to the right maxillary sinus. We have a nare up here, or a nostril, and then back here we have nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngeal pharynx. We've got oral cavity, we've got hard palate, we've got soft palate. Down here we have the larynx. As part of that we get epiglottis. We've got vocal folds, or vocal cords. We've got thyroid cartilage. And then back here we've got the back part of the cricoid cartilage. And while I'm here, as long as I'm here, here's esophagus on this model. And there's another nifty hole here. This hole is showing where the eustachian tube comes in. The auditory tube coming from the ear comes into the throat. Let's go to the chest of this model, because it's pretty cool, I think. This is the left lung. This is the superior lobe of the left lung and the inferior lobe of the left lung. And over here on the other side, we've got the right lung, superior lobe of the right lung, medial lobe of the right lung, and inferior lobe of the right lung. And let's take off the front of this lung. So there's the left lung removed, and we can nicely see the cardiac notch. Again, and what I like about this is here's the back part of the lung, and you can actually take the whole lung out. Just in case I get cut off by my battery, this is the diaphragm. And I'm going to take the heart out of this model. And notice what we have here. We have trachea. We've got right primary bronchus, left primary bronchus. Here's the aorta. Here's the esophagus coming down through the chest. This is the only model that I have that nicely shows the esophagus going all the way down. And notice this area here within the mediastinum, we've got a place where the trachea and the aorta and the esophagus run right next to each other inside of the mediastinum. Now that I've removed that piece, we've got the spinal cord that we can see in here, and now I can take out the other half of the left lung. And what I like about that is it really gives you an idea of how big the lungs are when they're fully inflated, at least. If I put the two halves together, now I've got the front and the back of the left lung all together. I can talk about some major structures of lungs. The apex, this up here is the top of the lung, close to your neck perhaps, and just under your clavicle. That's the apex of the lung. Down at the bottom, where it comes up against the diaphragm, this is the base of the lung. And then another structure here, this area here, where the tubes go in and out of the lung, the left primary bronchus in this case would come in here, and then we've got pulmonary artery here and pulmonary veins down here, and you would have other blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics running through here. This is called the hilus or hilum. It is the only place where the lung is actually directly attached, like in a tissue manner, in a strong protein manner. It's the only place it's attached to the body. The entire rest of the outside of the lung is not directly attached. Rather, it is surface tension of the serous fluid in there that keeps the lung up against the chest wall, for example. You can look back in here, and here's the right lung, and again you can see the whole thing, and you can see the hilum, and you can see the apex of the right lung, and of course under here would be the base of the right lung, and again here's the diaphragm. All right, that's all of my models. Let's do a little bit of quizzing. Let me grab my pointer again. Let's go to this model. Can you name this sinus? If you said frontal sinus, you're right. Can you name this structure? If you said left medial concha, you're correct. How about this whole cavity? Nasal cavity is the right answer for that. How about this sinus, as long as we're here? That's the sphenoid sinus. How about this structure? That is the soft palate. How about down here, name the entire organ? That is the larynx. How about name this structure? That is the epiglottis. What do we find here? What are these things? Those are vocal folds or vocal cords. Name this cartilage. That's the thyroid cartilage. How about name this ligament? It's the Cricothyroid Ligament. Let's go over here and look at this. This is a lung. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. It was supposed to be a quiz. Sorry. Name the organ. This one specifically, by the way, is the left lung, and we know that because there's two lobes. The superior lobe of left lung, inferior lobe of left lung, and this, name this feature. The answer to that is this is the cardiac notch, which is a feature unique to the left lung. How about name this muscle? And that, of course, is diaphragm. Let's go over to this lung here from the other model. And I did it again. I told you what it was, but name the organ. Be specific. If you said right lung, you're correct. And we know it's the right lung because of, in fact, let me see if I can get the shadow. Yeah. Name this lobe. If you said medial lobe of right lung, you are correct. And the right lung is the only one that has three, so it's also the only one with a medial lobe. Name the muscle. If you said diaphragm, you're correct. How about up in this model, name this organ. If you said trachea, you're correct. How about name this cartilage? Thyroid cartilage. Let's go up inside here and do one here. How about this? Name this structure. Correct answer there is the right inferior concha. How about one on this model? How about we name this ligament here? And the correct answer there is the Cricothyroid Ligament. Let's go over to this model. What are these little round things? Those are alveoli. How about this? If you said terminal bronchiole, you are correct. How about on this model? What is this? The correct answer is right primary bronchus. How about this one, this one, this one? If you said tertiary bronchi, you're correct. Let's play with the cat as the last thing we do here. Name the organ that we find here. Correct answer is trachea. And how about this organ? That is the right lung. And that's all I have battery for right now. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. And thank you once again for watching.